Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Erik Davis, continuing our conversations about the cultures of consciousness, and again, what is becoming a weekly refrain. Please, if you enjoy the show, take some time, write a review, get the word out wherever you get your casts, as they say. It'd be greatly appreciated. And again, there's a whole treasure trove of shows on technosis.com as well as Podbean. I was alerted that the Podbean RS feed only goes back to December 2016, so we're working on that because there's a lot more shows there, many years more worth of shows. So hopefully we'll be clearing that up so you can get those earlier shows as quickly as you can or as conveniently as you can. So last fall, a doctoral student reached out to me to do an interview for ethnography that she was doing on mindfulness technology. And so we talked, and the questions were very interesting, although she was a little cagey about where she was coming from. But that's what you're supposed to do when you're interviewing people. You don't want to, twist their ideas, impress them in too strong a way. So it was utterly appropriate. But I was very intrigued with her study because the idea of approaching this whole explosion of mindfulness and well-being technology and how it's transforming our ideas of Buddhism, of meditation, of well-being, and doing the technological entrepreneurial spin on these things is a fascinating topic. Sometimes a bit dismaying to me personally because it's not really where I'm coming from, even though I've always been interested in technology and believe in the approaches that are summed up in the local community's name, consciousness hacking. I think the idea that we are in physical bodies with these curious consciousness flows going on, and that we can nudge it and perturb it and expand it and intensify it, and that it's sort of our right to explore in that spirit. And I think a lot of spirituality in the modern world comes from that kind of urge to explore and the sort of self-reliance that it implies. There's problems with that view, of course. That's always part of the pie is the problems. But I'm really interested in this process at the same time as that's going on in this era of hypercapitalism and the sort of end of the world. It all becomes a little stranger when we start to factor in artificial intelligence and the management of affect and experience through technology, the ways in which experience design is becoming more and more robust and intensified. So I'm really looking forward to talking to the so far unnamed doctoral candidate, Rebecca Jablonsky, who is... she's getting her PhD at the Science Technology Studies at Rensselaer Polytechnic, but she's currently in Berkeley. She's lived in the Bay Area before, and I was really interested to find out before she entered her PhD program doing technology studies, which is a great field. It's one of my favorite fields in academia right now. I think that a lot of the best questions are being asked there. But before that, she was a UX designer, a user experience designer. My wife was a user experience designer for a long time, and so I've been around that community and a lot of the issues for quite a long time. And I think that's going to add an interesting twist to the conversation, that she's not just coming from a academic background. So with no further ado, Rebecca, welcome to Expanding Mind.
Thank you. Thanks, Erik. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So are you done with your ethnography?
No, I'm right in the thick of it. I started probably around the end of summer 2018, and I'll continue my ethnography through September or October 2019. Man. So I have a good sense of some of the themes that have emerged, but I'm also very much still in the thick of it.
God, how many people are you going to be talking to in the end?
I think I estimated around 50, but it's not just talking to people. So, you and I did a one-on-one interview. A lot of the work that I do as an ethnographer is embedding myself in cultures of technology, which being in the Bay Area really helps doing that, getting that sort of immediate experience of the technology industry by going to events, going to conferences. The consciousness hacking community that you mentioned actually has been a really good avenue for my research in that. So there's a lot of observational as well as speaking and interview components to the work.
I wanted to mention, since we're talking about consciousness hacking, and I suspect you're going to be there as well, up in May 18th and 19th here in San Francisco, they're holding the Awakened Futures Summit. And it's even kind of interesting to read the copy, because it kind of sets the stage for our conversation. I mean, the summit is devoted to the intersection of psychedelics, technology, and meditation, which is already kind of mind-blowing to me that can be said so sort of as a matter of course these days. And together we'll explore how the renaissance of psychedelic science and the mainstreaming of contemplative practices might combine with the latest transformative technologies to create the next paradigm of healing and awakening. There's so many things going on in that already. How did you come to be drawn to this really interesting field based on your earlier work, or you're even living in the Bay Area, or doing work in the UX world? When you entered into the technology studies program, what was it about this particular kind of conjunction of technology and expanded consciousness or consciousness practices that drew you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I should say I didn't start off my PhD thinking that I would study meditation apps. It kind of happened a little bit more organically after a while. But my inspiration for what I applied to do the PhD for was a lot of what I was seeing in the Bay Area. I was very embedded in alternative health and healing communities within Silicon Valley. I lived in Oakland. And I found that a lot of people sort of posited alternative healing and embodiment as a direct opposition to the effects of technology on well-being and on society, how technology was controlling the mind and the body. In particular, I'm thinking of movements around that time, 2015, 2016. There were a number of digital detox retreats that were popping up, kind of these boutique experiences in which people can pay to get away from technology and sort of enter this more immediate primal state of being in community. And so that was my original interest when applying into the PhD program. But then I'm sure, as you know, things change as you start to take classes, read the literature, see what's out there.
And so what was it? Was there a particular kind of technology or event or something that really gave you a sense of the interesting issues that were brought together with the new wave of apps and just the whole kind of blending of entrepreneurial technology culture and mindfulness?
Yeah. Well, when I heard about meditation apps probably in 2016 or 2017, and I didn't know that I'd end up studying them. But I had a course paper I had to write. It was called Movement Through the World, or writing a paper that moves somebody, the reader, through a world. And I thought it would be an interesting experiment to put myself through the meditation app programs of these emerging apps, and then to, describe them, to render them, to move the reader through what it feels like to use them. So I did that with a couple of popular meditation apps. I think it was Headspace and Calm. I did those intro programs and I wrote about it. And one of the first meditations, maybe it was in the middle of the program, I opened up the app. I don't remember which app it was. I opened up the app to start a meditation. And then I got a notification on my phone, an email from the meditation app company, basically encouraging me to buy their product. So I guess opening up the app triggered this email. And then it sort of ironically disrupted me. It distracted me from doing the meditation. So I kind of went into my habitual mode where I automatically opened the notification. I went to my inbox. I looked at the email, Then I got distracted by another email in my inbox. Once I was there, it was sort of like the context switch had happened. And then I had to sort of bring myself back to remember, oh yeah, I had planned on meditating at that moment, but I was checking my email instead. And so, yeah, that experience really opened my eyes to the sort of paradox that meditation apps, I think, embody in this moment culturally, and that many people are framing a lot of social problems in technical terms, how sort of technology is impacting people and society at the level of consciousness and also at the level of social relationships. But then here, meditation apps sort of present technology as a potential solution to the problems. It's sort of using the very same medium to deal with both problem and solution. So that, I think, is one of the most interesting aspects of studying meditation apps, that people are moving away from purely escaping technology to sort of working within technology's parameters to find personal growth and healing.
Yeah, that's true. That is a shift. And of course, they're not mutually exclusive. Like I know people who are very much consciousness hacker type of folks, but they'll take a day off tech. There's a lot of folks who do like a Shabbat, like they're like a tech-free Shabbat. That's the way they do it. Their Saturdays are to turn off all the machines, but they're totally technology people otherwise. So it's a wide range of things. But I have to admit, I've never looked at a meditation app. I developed my meditation practice all by myself. And so it seems kind of weird to me. So I would never do that. But I'm actually just kind of curious, like what do these things offer? I mean, what are they just like goads? Is it a way, like, so if I'm someone who's trying to start a meditation practice, how do they make things easier or more efficient or more powerful or whatever the word we want to use is, from just, forcing myself to sit on the pillow every morning for a half an hour or something?
In terms of what they offer, I mean, they offer a number of things, the most basic of which is just a library of guided meditations, some of which are put into sort of specific programs. So like a 10-day meditation program for anxiety, for example. So there's a little bit more of, directing the user towards specific paths that might be useful for them.
What are the various features they have other than guided meditations? I know that some of them have, like, they'll show that other people who are using it at that same time, so you don't feel like you're like meditating alone. It's like, oh wow, there's like 200 people right now who are meditating. I'm going to join them. I know some have that kind of feature. I'm just thinking of the different ways in which the affordances of the technology are used in order to encourage people or draw them into practice.
Yeah. So a good example of another feature, which I think is a little bit more abstract, but for the Calm app, for example, when you open the Calm app, basically you're entering this sort of natural world, a sort of dynamic waterscape where there's water, there's sort of flowing water, and there are birds chirping. They kind of like recreate this natural environment upon opening the app. And I think you could actually change it. So you might want to have like a crackling fire instead of this body of water as your main screen. But a lot of these apps sort of try to transport the user to another frame of mind through atmosphere. So the visual and music, the music component is another thing. So the apps have nature sounds, relaxing music. Some people use the apps for what are called sleep stories, which are basically adult bedtime stories. It's a very relaxing, soothing narrator, slowly telling the user a story that they might be vaguely interested in, but they don't have to pay attention to fully. And people listen to this as they sort of drift into sleep. It helps them sort of like just an adult bedtime story. So yeah, there are a number of features that the apps provide.
And had you done much meditation before you started to do this exploration?
I had, yeah. I did yoga teacher training, so meditation was a large component of that. I've been in the yoga community for probably about 6 or 7 years now. So my experience has mainly been through in-person communities, but I do use the apps as a sort of way to explore my research topic.
I'm curious, when you were describing all of especially the design elements, the role of nature sounds, and the kind of voiceovers, I just kind of flashed on the fact that there was a sort of an analog anticipation of this, if you will, with the explosion really of the new age in the early 1980s, late 70s, early 1980s, when it's not just that people were making music, but the music was packaged as a kind of science of consciousness alteration, with particular emphasis on calming, on de-stressing. And there were, many claims made that kind of fused scientific claims about frequencies with sort of, psychedelic new age tantric imagery of chakras and healing vibrations, and kind of melding them together, often with nature sounds. Some tapes would just be environmental sounds. And what's interesting about these things, which were mostly on cassette, is that they did have to do with their own sort of technological evolution. Like, it was partly the availability of inexpensive cassette tapes that enabled this sort of world to emerge, which was very much focused on that particular technology, rather than, CDs hadn't really started coming in yet, and more than vinyl albums, because they were sort of more handy. They're the early days of the Walkman. So there was this sort of, in a way, a kind of anticipation of this, except it was very much in an analog mode, and obviously much less interactive than these can be. But there's sort of a longer dream behind this technology of integrated ways to bring technical devices, states of consciousness, a sort of design ethos, or an atmosphere, a kind of aesthetic language to help people de-stress. I mean, that's largely tends to be the goal, is that modernity, is overwhelming, and here's this paradoxical object that can, balance it out. But do you think that how deep does that paradox go? How painful does that paradox become? That the very tool that's sort of causing the stress or causing the complexity is then turned to as a solution to the stress or complexity?
Well, I think you could approach this question from a number of perspectives. So I think, from the perspective of people making the tools, that, these are very necessary antidote to, how digital technology is currently designed. And a number of the companies certainly play on this sort of juxtaposition in how they frame their tools. So a component of my research is also doing digital ethnography, sort of tracking how these tools are represented and spoken about on online forums, popular media articles, etc. So early in my field work, I came upon an interesting finding just personally. As I was browsing Twitter, I sort of was presented with a video from Calm. Calm was, posting these sort of videos of nature, a flower sort of flowing in the wind, and then a little timer, and it was a countdown timer, and it said, "Stop what you're doing," and it said something like, "Stop scrolling for a moment. Is there something you'd rather be doing right now?" And then there was a little timer that said, "Do nothing for 30 seconds." So from the perspective of these companies, they sort of frame these tools as disruptions in the normal digital stream, the sort of normal habitual behaviors that people are enacting in the digital world. It's kind of like inserting a very a slower, more expansive experience into the fast-paced digital life, or that's at least how they frame it.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I'd never thought about exactly the disruptive character of that framework, and it reminds me a little bit of the stop exercises that Gurdjieff would have. People would be doing work in his community and digging holes or whatever he was having to do, and then he would just go stop, and you were supposed to like literally physically hold your body in this way, and then have that opportunity to what he called self-remember, which is related in some ways to some aspects of mindfulness. Basically, the idea is to develop the capacity to disrupt your normal chain as part of this like larger expansion or growth towards a more integrated self. And it's interesting because it's another one of these paradoxes, because even if we associate those states themselves, at least generally, with a kind of sense of expansion, of a lack of conflict, a lack of juxtaposition, it's like they're sort of integrated, they're holistic, that nonetheless those kinds of states in the midst of our other lives are forms of disruption. And indeed, it seems like one of the ways that people work to stay awake in our current milieu is to learn ways to remind yourself, whatever ways they are, in meditation, using apps, paying attention to things in your environment that will remind you, developing sort of habits that deconstruct other habits. I mean, it seems to be one of the big challenges is how to interrupt in a way that you actually do something different after that moment.
Definitely, yeah. But then a sort of counterpoint to this that others have brought up is, if you are outsourcing awareness or attention to the technology itself, then is that really attention or awareness that you're developing as a skill for yourself? And that's a sort of open question, I think, that people are really grappling with. Is it some people, they reflect in the interviews, for example, they're not really sure if they're learning to meditate better, or if they are they becoming more aware, or are they outsourcing their awareness to technology? And then what are the consequences of that?
Wow, that's a very interesting way of thinking about it. I mean, the more obvious example we have is how we've done that with our memories. And I'm old enough to remember when you remembered people's phone numbers, and that's a trivial example, but it holds a lot more than that. I'm very aware of the way in which Google is sort of part of my composing strategy when I'm sitting and writing a text, or when I'm having conversations with people. It's like it's sort of woven into the field in a way. And so in many ways we've been outsourcing our memory to technology for a very, very long time, but it's noticeable, the uptick and the intensification that's gone through. But what you're describing is something that's subtler and even more intimate, and in that sense more disturbing, but or potentially, but also in a way kind of inevitable in terms of how tightly our whole minds are coupled to technology, not just the seeking rational mind that wants to find the answer to something, or wants to use a word processor in order to create a text to send somebody for some practical gain. Instead of that, it's like our emotional lives, our social lives, and increasingly the very kind of intimate flow of our own consciousness is bound up with these things. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about how some of the people you talk to who use these technologies, reflected or considered that outsourcing of awareness as either a problem or an inevitability, or even a kind of cyborg possibility that's kind of exciting and interesting in certain ways.
Yeah, the cyborg is something that comes up a lot in the academic conversations. But I think what you're pointing to is a question of do people identify as technology as being a part of them or outside of them? And I think a lot of the people I'm speaking to who use meditation apps think about a sort of ecosystem, an information ecosystem in which they are part of a larger world that includes technology, includes other people. There's very much a reflection of how the individual relates to the environment, and how individuals and environments co-create each other. So I think at least I found the meditation app users are more likely to think relationally about these things. And so they're less, I'm seeing the argument, we have to get away from technology, to be less and less irrelevant in my interviews. That people are seeing technology and other people and thoughts and the world and the physical things to be all part of the same ecosystem.
Oh, that's very interesting. That makes sense to me. It raises another question that I think I've been noticing recently. I've read a number of articles from people explaining why, let's say, they get off Facebook, or they're lessening their social media, or changing their relationship to their phones, and they're not the media fast versions that you talked about, the ones where you have to get away from it entirely. But a lot of the reasons seem to come from a growing awareness of their experience of their relationship to these feeds as being addictive or disruptive, or of taking over something that they used to enjoy, like sitting, having 3 minutes free when you're waiting for something and you just loaf, you just sit there. Like, just loafing is very difficult to do when you have a phone. You're always checking your feeds, you're checking the news, and how it's not so much about like, oh my God, the technology's evil and taking away my mind. It's that realizing that there's a lot of different ways to interact with technology, and that part of the problem of our situation right now is just that some of the very compulsive affordances of technology have been taken up kind of unthinkingly, and that if we are in some kind of weird race where people are trying to not just give in to all of the prompts and all of the habits, all of the dopamine hits. I mean, that's a great example, the way that that's become a part of popular culture, people talking about dopamine in relationship to getting a like or getting a response on social media. It shows that there's an awareness that there's kind of a biophysical dimension to this that has a kind of out of control character. It's like almost a race to see if we can still, keep waking up rather than just submitting to what can, from in a paranoid perspective, look like subtle and increasingly less subtle forms of mind control.
Yeah, and I think the open question is whether, what do meditation apps reflect? Are they just another form of habitual compulsion, a sort of relaxation, just an automatic way to sort of relax somebody, or are they, tools for facilitating personal growth and awareness? And I think they can be both.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, and I think there's not really a way to determine, which it is globally. I think it really, I'm seeing people grapple with this on a very individual level, where they realize that they're using the app for a purpose, and then they eventually realize that this purpose is the wrong purpose to have. And that's something that's pretty common in meditation communities in general, is rethinking and reflecting upon why you're doing what you're doing, why you're thinking what you're thinking. And so people are, really being thrown into these loops.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way. I mean, I'm glad you made that connection that, it's not just about the technology and people using it and then coming to some determination that it's not exactly the way they want to do it, that's part of a larger thing where people, I mean, I've been meditating for, almost 30 years, but I spent a couple years doing what I would now call is just creating a self-induced trance, and at the time I was like, oh man, I'm really meditating. And now I'm like, no man, you were just like hypnotizing yourself basically. And of course, all these terms are themselves mobile and redefinable, and one person's meditation is another person's trance. And, what we mean by meditation is so varied that, anywhere you go, you're going to be running into these same kinds of issues. But that iterative process, that self-critical process, that seems to me to be really positive. I mean, that when I talk about the race, it almost seems like that there's no way to avoid getting drawn into fantasies or compulsive behaviors or things that you think are one thing but are actually another thing. That going forward is the process of engaging those experiences and then hopefully, using critique or awareness, other people's input, seeing them from another angle, and then maybe changing that behavior or abandoning it altogether and moving on. The fear I think that people have around technology is that they're going to get stuck. Like there's some kind of that's where that compulsive thing, or the binging on Netflix or whatever, there's a sense that there's like a stuckness to it. Whereas the possibility that it just becomes part of an ongoing investigation that at least hopefully moves in positive directions seems, in a way, kind of a middle path between either saying technology is terrible, it's the last thing that has anything to do with personal growth, and just this kind of capitulation to the whole entrepreneurial self in an unthinking way.
Definitely, yeah. The middle path is a big theme that comes up in my work.
I'm curious if you could talk more about some of the people in terms of how they negotiated their changing relationships with the apps.
I think ultimately people are looking for a changed relationship with life itself, and the digital technology often kind of stands in for this larger problem in society. They're not necessarily technology and society. The relationship is kind of more complex than public discourse really allows. So I think people are really looking for a change to their life, to the experience, how they experience the world, how they go about the world. And then there's also this feeling that, what parts of the world can people actually change? And that's a sort of a larger question, is what can you intervene upon? So a lot of, the common sort of trope is that you can't change the world, but you can change yourself. And I think that many meditation app users and many meditators sort of approach changing the world through changing the self, that by changing your relationship to the world, you're changing your life, you're changing your phenomenological experience, but then the way you interact with your environment, what you put out there, it sort of creates a different type of feedback loop that not only changes your experience, but others' experiences. So changing yourself can make the world better, ultimately. And I think that's where a lot of people are coming from.
Does that apply to the creators as well, the engineers, the marketers, the business folk, the entrepreneurs who are behind these apps? Obviously you've spoken to a lot of them, but I'd be curious to get your sense of where they're coming from in terms of a sincere commitment to the hope of human flourishing, or more of a, hey, here's a new market, a new set of customers who can be treated to algorithmic processes in a way that makes us some money. I mean, there's a whole range in between, but I'm curious what your sense was of the intent of the people who are developing these programs.
I think the intent is largely positive. A lot of people in the industry that I've spoken to have extensive experience with meditation. Some are meditation teachers, or they've done extensive monastic training in some capacity. They've done 10-day meditation retreats. They have that sort of experience and that personal story about why they think meditation is important, and it can be a little bit evangelical at times, in that they're trying to then enroll millions and millions of people into these experiences that they personally had. But I think the intention is generally quite positive. But in terms of the medium and how meditation apps exist within a larger technical infrastructure and ecosystem, I question whether or not, even at the level of a technology designer, how much control you have over that ecosystem, whether you're able to really embed alternative values into these systems that were already built and in place.
Yeah, that's a really incisive point. One of the ways that I think about it is it's a really basic one, and it just kind of so happens that my my main training in meditation and in Buddhism is Zen, and a particular flavor of Soto Zen that places a lot of emphasis on no gaining thoughts. You know, that the idea that you're doing something to achieve something is like essentially part of the problem. And this goes back to Dogen Zenji, and it's a very robust part of the discourse where what they call gaining ideas gets in your way. That in this view, meditation is liberation. It's not like you're meditating to become liberated. And of course, it's a paradox because you're sitting there, you're going, I don't feel liberated, but that paradox, or that an invitation to let go of the gaining mind, is at the core of this particular flavor practice. This is not the case across Buddhism or different meditation regimes. It just happens to be the one that I was sort of brought up in. And that gives me a particularly interesting angle on one of the ways in which I think meditation apps don't evade the larger ecosystem of capitalist self-advancement, achievement, the entrepreneurial self, as people like to call it. And that has to do with the fact that you're always doing this for some purpose. And obviously you're feeling unhappy or anxious and you're working for something and you're doing it because you want to not be anxious. That's fine. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the way that the very capacity to withstand greater degrees of stress then itself becomes part of your skill set, which then goes out and is able to essentially compete in a market in a more robust fashion. And I've met a lot of people like this, people who are clearly have achieved, insight, levels of consciousness, degrees of self-control, degrees of self-awareness that are notable, and yet it becomes sort of packaged and, if you will, weaponized in a way precisely to go back into the fray, except now at a sort of higher state. And that's the part where I things get really complicated for me, is that it's the same kind of idea of optimization. And you'll even hear this in I'll be listening to some meditation teacher going on, and they'll talk about the optimal way to move through some tricky meditational conundrum. And I'm like, optimal. Like, is there, maybe there isn't a way out. Maybe once optimal is part of the way that deleterious capitalism reproduces itself, then it's really hard to figure out how to even practice where you want goals, you want breakthroughs, you want to get better. But at the same time, unless there's some really strong relationship to this idea that I've learned about practices is liberation, or no gaining idea, or as Aleister Crowley put it, no lust of result, that idea, unless you balance that, then it becomes really easy to just reproduce the same drive that is so pervasive throughout the society.
Definitely, yeah. I think you bring up a lot of interesting points. Do we in the United States have the cultural tools to really grapple with meditation, with some of the belief systems, the history of these practices as they existed? Should we develop the cultural tools to really sort of embody alternative visions? I do see a lot in popular media, popular discourse about achievement. You're right, optimization, even framing the companies, the technology companies, as in a battle, a mindful battle with each other. That we don't have the cultural words to really understand these tools through a different framework, that we constantly put competition, achievement, optimization. We layer these things on top of them until they're sort of, their meanings might be potentially lost. But on the other hand, can you imagine a meditation app putting an advertisement out on Twitter or Facebook and saying, download this app, you will get nothing from it?
No, it's true. Even though in a lot of ways, that's what, there's a lot of teachings where that's what you get at the end. It's like, you thought you were going to get something, you're not going to get anything. And And whereas that kind of thinking, that sort of paradoxical, even ironic thinking about the ultimate purposelessness, or the fact that you get climbed the ladder and you get to the end and it's just a shoot down to where you started, that was part of the popular countercultural spiritual mind frame. Not the dominant part necessarily, certainly not the dominant part of 70s self-actualization, but it was a very definite current within Buddhism, within spiritual practice in general, a kind of playfulness or an irony about exactly what you're doing with it. It had a sort of existential character to it. So it's not that these things are too complicated, it's just that, like you say, I think that the conditions have changed so radically that people don't, they're not amused or even attracted to, hey, download this app, it's not going to get you anything, which is kind of funny. It's kind of, that's sort of attractive to me. But we really are in it's a different time. But that's part of what, from my perspective is I really wonder about what gets lost when even the kind of weird translations of different religious traditions that we had in the countercultural period, even when those translations kind of dissolve and meditation and becomes mindfulness, and mindfulness becomes well-being, and well-being is just sort of part of the management of the body-mind as it withstands the pressures of the contemporary moment, that something really is lost. And I can speak about it from the liberation point of view, like from a more quote unquote religious point of view in terms of Buddhism or other practices, or Vajrayana or whatever. But even leaving that aside, it still is. I find it a little unnerving. There's what calls you out, what pulls people to another dimension, a way of a perspective on their lives that's sufficiently outside of that normal churn, that something really can happen. But maybe it does, and that's just me sitting back being a little cranky. You've talked to a lot of people. Have people who are using these apps really had breakthroughs, or things that were life-changing, things where they ended up acting differently in the world?
Definitely. Yeah, I've definitely heard a lot of positive stories about the apps. But there is a sort of ironic thing that I've found, which is that many people feel like once they reach a certain point with the apps, they no longer need the apps. And so that's something interesting to think about. And certainly a lot of app designers have expressed this, that ultimately they think that the app is a sort of tool for beginners, a sort of entry point into a larger exploration that technology can't always mediate and shouldn't always mediate. How they're reflecting that, will that eventually, will the business eventually sort of overshadow that initial plan? I'm not sure. It's not good for business to say, you use the app and then eventually just forget about it. So I think long term, I think it's unclear how these apps will position themselves in people's lives. But from the user perspective, they've been very helpful starting points to think about things, to explore practices. I think in the Bay Area in particular, we're a little bit spoiled. We have a lot of access to alternative modalities. But one of the ways that technology is being presented in the communities that I've been a part of is a sort of a bridge to people who don't necessarily have these communities. And that's certainly been the case for, a number of technologies, to sort of create these virtual worlds of experience that you wouldn't have access to maybe in, a more rural area.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's the for me, the biggest paradox of a lot of these popularizations is that I tend to be kind of cranky about the way they look in my world, how they show up in as someone who lives in San Francisco, who has already been doing this for a long time and kind of came from more of an underground perspective. So then I'm like, this is kind of cheesy. It's kind of easy. It's like, it's a little bit too that flavor of tang that comes with a lot of Silicon Valley interventions in our well-being or in our consciousness. But I really totally change my tune when I start thinking about how these things are operating globally or in a lot of communities where there's not a lot of access to things. And this really gets into the other question that I wanted to, kind of main question line that I wanted to ask in this last 10 minutes or so, which is about, we're in a mental health crisis. America, the U.S., the world, I think it's only going to get worse because things are only going to get weirder. They're just going to get more stressful and more strange. So if we're already in a mental health crisis, issues of anxiety, of depression, of paranoia, of psychosis, although that's a little harder to say how its rates are changing. But in any case, we're definitely in the situation, and there's not enough doctors, there's not enough money in the system to get people what they want. So a lot of people looking at it like systemically are going, Jesus, what are we going to do with all these people? And one of the answers is saying, like, look, you can do cognitive behavior therapy online. You can even have the algorithms do it, and you can get some of the basic tools out there, because a lot of it has to do with like habituating yourself to certain sort of feedback loops and certain sort of ways of gaining perspective on your own mind. And clearly that kind of works to a certain level. And in a lot of ways, these meditation apps, they're kind of part of that current, in a way, taking them out of the like spiritual growth or, well-being industry, and kind of looking at them in a way as another expression of the fact that a lot of suffering people aren't going to have a lot of opportunity for robust either therapy or spiritual groups, and these things are ways that people can learn basic mind training in order to at least set in motion something that probably at some point would require more sophisticated or more personal work. So that kind of adds a whole different flavor to it. Are people thinking in those terms, or are people still really thinking more in terms of spirituality, well-being, integration, consciousness?
Most of the meditation apps frame these tools not as spiritual, but as secular. But they certainly serve a function that would be similar to spirituality. You can see how they might be similar in function, but not name, for a number of reasons. And there's also the element, I think when you were speaking about your experience, you interpret these apps as almost like losing something that is available, this sort of wider framework. But for many people in the United States, you can't lose something that you never necessarily had. It's a new context, a more complete secularization, and it's sort of standing in for something that maybe in the past would have existed, but doesn't necessarily exist in the person's life. So it's filling a gap. So maybe your experience, it appears like a loss, but many people have never had these things to begin with, never had these tools or communities. I'm glad you mentioned the mental health crisis, because that's, I've mainly spoken in this podcast about the digital technology, attention, sort of public conversation. But the mental health crisis I see as a sort of parallel conversation within which meditation apps and self-care practices really should be spoken about. There's a question of like you mentioned, self-reliance, self-help. I think certainly at an individual level, nobody would say it's bad to help yourself. It seems kind of illogical to say that. Don't help yourself. But then on a social level, I think we have to take a step back and ask, are these apps, are these solutions, are they just patches for a very large socio-technical problem that's becoming more and more out of control? Or are we kidding ourselves by thinking that these apps will help? I mean, it just I think that for every conversation about individuality and self-help, we have to also balance it by thinking about the larger social implications about what are these tools hiding? What are they not only revealing, but what are they concealing about how our society works? And are we okay with that?
Well, can you talk a little more? What do you see them concealing? These particular meditation apps, what are they concealing?
I think they do run the risk of ignoring social policies, for example, that might, social policies, just general social conditions about how different people experience things like stress, health, work, a big component, work-related stress, what this means for different people who are treated differently by society. I think that's sort of a conversation that, needs to be a part of it.
Yeah, it's a really interesting problem. I think a lot about this. It's not clear to me how the social awareness and the urgency of thinking in social terms becomes part of, or is folded in, or is married to this self-practice that inevitably has some kind of internal dimension, and does even have an element of, you can't change the world, you can change yourself. You can't change your immediate stressful working environment, so you can change yourself. And that's true. Like, the Stoic aspect of that is true. It's just that that's a truth that has certain consequences when it becomes the only truth. But how to build a bridge between those two, and I know people have been trying for a long time. I mean, Buddhists historically have been very good progressive liberals, and they've been, working their hearts out for the environment and for some social conditions and things. So it's part of the discourse. But in another way, it doesn't look very, I don't know, there's a long way to go. And so that it seems valuable that you're looking at that stressor in your work. And we just have a couple minutes, but I'm curious have you thought about ways that these things might come together more, or how they can be part of a more engaged social perspective?
I see my work as a way to contribute to this public dialogue. I think that we are, we're too often presented with these, either or frameworks where technology can be either bad or either good. And one of the sort of benefits of doing ethnographic research is having these sort of more nuanced details of how these technologies play out in different people's lives. So I've been, very cognizant of who I'm recruiting into my research. I'm not only talking to, wealthy tech entrepreneurs, but I'm also talking to people in diverse communities in the Bay Area, not only about their health and their stress, but how they experience the technology industry firsthand in the sort of immediacy of their lives. And I think, having these stories is one step. To the extent to which I could then translate my academic research to public conversation is another issue. And if you have any advice on that as a podcaster, I'd be willing to, talk about that. But I think that, having this sort of more nuanced, empirical, I actually spoke to people and observed people, and they've sort of co-created this with me. I think moving forward is important to sort of analyze the broader social impacts and the context of these tools.
Yeah, I think you're doing really important work. I encourage people who are listening to pay attention to sociology, particularly when people are doing ethnographic research, because if you read journalists and you kind of trust them, then you have even more reason to trust the rigor that goes into ethnographies. There can still be problems, blah, 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 distortions, selection bias. All those things are still true, but it's a very, very good way to get a sense of what's going on on the ground, in these really complicated fields. So I'm glad you're doing the work you do, and I'm sure you'll find a way to be part of that public conversation, because we need you. Anyway, thanks so much for joining us on Expanding Mind.
Thank you.
All right. It was Rebecca Jablonsky, who's at Rensselaer, currently at Berkeley doing research on mindfulness tech. Until next week, keep your minds open.